very, very much for the invitation to be here. It's a great honour to be here. Today, what I'm going to be talking about are the difficulties in covering humanitarian crises, why good information and trustworthy news coverage of international affairs is important, but sadly often elusive. I'm going to talk about some of the structural issues which prevent journalism from being able to be as impactful in delivering good information as most people believe it should be. In other words, I'm going to be talking about the challenges in reporting humanitarian crises. Now, I'm now, as I mentioned, an academic, but I'm also a former foreign correspondent who covered 8 civil wars and the collapse of both Soviet communism and the Soviet Union. All of those crises, of course, created a humanitarian crisis across a very, very vast area of land, impacting many, many tens of millions of people. So working journalists are the first to acknowledge that they play a critical role in bringing attention to humanitarian crises, whether that crisis is the result of war or natural disaster or political abuse. At the onset of a humanitarian crisis, journalists are often the first to arrive and the last to leave. Their role is to bear witness, to question narratives, to ensure that the stories of those who are affected by the crises are actually heard. When chaos strikes, it's journalists who break through all the noise and bring the realities of chaos into your living rooms, into your boardrooms, into parliaments around the world. They turn distant tragedy into urgent matters of concern. Journalists will also acknowledge that they are not just passive observers, that they have emotions. They have personal history. They have views about what they're seeing. They're products of the societies and the political systems in which they grew up, all of which the ethics of their profession demands that they somehow leave the door. Some, of course, do, and some don't. But as a result of the ethical codes and the editorial policies that govern their work, even when they're in far-flung places covering the worst of crises, they are not meant to be active participants in shaping the course of the humanitarian crisis that they're covering. Journalists will also acknowledge the inherent limitations of the impact journalism can have beyond alerting the world to the scale of a disaster when events are spiralling out of control. One significant limitation is the transient nature of news coverage. Journalism is often driven by the demand for fresh, breaking stories, which means that attention is almost always fleeting. A humanitarian crisis might dominate headlines for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, but eventually the service moves on to the next big story, and often before the crisis is resolved. 2014, the Ebola crisis, for example, in West Africa, it received intense media coverage at its peak, but as soon as the immediate threat subsided, attention fell away, even though the affected countries continued to struggle with the long-term consequences of the epidemic. Journalism didn't help, let alone stop the crisis. Did we ever expect it to? Another news cycle impact is story choice, how editors and journalists choose what to cover, which oddly seems to be entirely uncontroversial for most journalists. There are currently 30 major and minor violent disputes occurring around the world, according to the Council of Foreign Relations Conflict Tracker. Why are some covered and others not? Why are we focused, say, on Gaza or Ukraine, where the Democratic Republic of Congo is in crisis? Conflict has killed some 6 million people there. 6 million people. Why not Yemen, where 21.6 million people need aid, including 11 million children? Or Burundi, where the death toll from conflict stands at 300,000. And what about Sudan? The way editorial decisions are made is driven by funding limitations, by geopolitical consideration, and ultimately, sadly, bias, which identifies some people as more valuable, more deserving of international outrage and concern than others. And sometimes all three of those factors work together to create a complete picture of partiality, which surely presents as a limitation on how journalism can assist in a crisis. Some of this might be a little bit unpopular, but bear with me. And I preface these comments by saying that none of this is to in any way excuse or justify the abhorrent breach of international law by Russia in its invasion of its neighbour Ukraine. I wish really to talk about the technicalities of the coverage. So the coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war, I think, is a case study in reporting which has been influenced by political interest, dovetailing with the funding crisis that has seen a diminished number of foreign correspondents. I'm going to use my own country as an example here. In Australia, the ABC has over two decades, the ABC is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, our national broadcaster, experienced funding cuts that have disproportionately impacted foreign corresponding. As a result, a large Moscow bureau where I served was closed, leaving reporters hubbed in London to fly in and fly out when needed. That left Australia with no one in Russia to closely observe years of an escalating rhetoric of aggression emanating from the Kremlin towards the United States, particularly in relation to Moscow's limited role in creating a new security architecture for Europe, including in countries where Moscow was, prior to the collapse of communism and the USSR in 1991, the dominant power of influence. The information field was left open to influence by political and geopolitical narrative. By ignoring the factors contributing to the illegal invasion of Ukraine, it gave permission for journalists to serve geopolitical interest rather than to report in context and therefore in the public interest. This is not a mere assertion on my part. We've been conducting research at the Centre for Media Transition, where I currently work in Sydney, which indicates that Western news and media organisations have had a strong propensity to report the Western frames of reference for the current Russian-Ukraine war, leaving Russian frames, excluding propaganda, to be pilloried as non-existent or ridiculous. The nature of the conflict was couched in terms of a return to the USSR, which allowed knowledgeable voices whose eyes were firmly focused on the region to be ignored and condemned. None of this, again, is to excuse the invasion of Ukraine. It is merely talking about how it has been reported. There's an issue too of accessing crisis zones. Journalists are often barred from entering them or face severe restrictions on their movement and reporting. This can lead to a reliance on second-hand information, which can be incomplete or worse, biased, which was evident, as we all, I think, might agree, in the early stages of the Syrian civil war, when journalists had limited access to conflict zones, and as a result, much of the reporting relied on information provided by activist groups, which, though valuable, didn't always present a complete and contextualised picture of the situation. We're seeing the same play out in Gaza right now, where access to the territory has been denied by Israel, though in this case, information on the conflict between Hamas and Israel has come largely from the two combatants, and led to a crisis within journalism about which side is to be more believed, and whether the journalistic norm of impartiality is up to the task of determining the truth. The argument goes journalists should be allowed to stray from the need to be balanced and surmise that extraordinary numbers of deaths reveal a truth that the processes of impartial reporting cannot. That when the weight of evidence is clear, it is wrong to conceal the truth. Well, yes, of course, and clearly that would be wrong. Was balance missing in the first weeks of the coverage? This slide shows Israeli versus Gazan frames in that first few weeks of coverage from Guardian Australia, the ABC, that is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, 9 News and News Corp's The Australian. 71% of journalism pieces reflected Israeli frames, only 29.1% reflected Palestinian frames. That balance of reporting changed over time. But the wave of pro-Israel reporting in the immediate aftermath of the attack led younger journalists to claim that striving for impartiality. The wave of pro-Israel reporting in the immediate aftermath of the attack led younger journalists in the main to claim that striving for impartiality is false equivalence, when for them there's only one story that needs to be platformed in order not to dehumanise the Palestinians and to avoid biased reporting. In Australia, a petition was signed to demand that when reporting this conflict, reporters must reference the 1948 Nakba, but not October 7. They demanded prior to the ICJ rulings that they be permitted to declare a genocide, that the intergenerational trauma of the Jews be relegated to history because it's being used to excuse the horrific death and destruction caused by Israel. Well, I'm not convinced that that formula delivers either truth or balance. Now, even when journalists can access crisis zones, there are safety concerns. Humanitarian crises and conflict zones are very dangerous places. Which of course limits the scope of where you can go. In Gaza, more than 100 Palestinian journalists have been killed so far. There's audience fatigue. The public's capacity to absorb stories of suffering and injustice is actually quite limited. They turn off. In conclusion, when journalists can bring attention to humanitarian crises and human rights abuses, it is not equipped to solve the problems or get anywhere near it. Journalists can report on atrocities, expose abuse, question narrative, raise awareness, but they cannot intervene. Bearing witness doesn't make us actors. Our reporting has been used to bring perpetrators to justice, as they did during the conflict, for example, in Darfur and in Myanmar, but activism should be, and actually usually is, extremely uncomfortable for journalists.